He came back to his late grandfather's ranch just to sell the land. But when he and his loyal German shepherd opened the old barn, they found something that had been buried for decades, a soldier's secret, and a truth that could destroy everything. If you love stories that cut deep and stay with you, like and subscribe for more. The old Ford groaned as it crawled up the last bend of the snow-dusted road. Daniel Cross kept both hands on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale against the cracked leather. The heater coughed weakly, doing little to fight the Montana cold. Beside him, a German shepherd sat upright alert, its amber eyes scanning the white fields that stretched endlessly beyond the glass. "Almost there," Bear Daniel murmured. His voice was rough from years of sand smoke and silence. The dog's ears twitched at his tone as if it understood that this drive wasn't about homecoming, it was about ghosts. The wooden gate appeared at the next turn, its sign swinging crookedly in the Windcross Ranch. Daniel exhaled through his nose, a shaky breath clouding the windshield. He hadn't seen this place in over 20 years, not since the funeral that sealed his heart away with the past. The snow crunched as he stepped out, boots pressing deep into the frozen dirt. The air smelled like pine and rust, like memory. Bear jumped down next to him, sniffing the ground tail stiff as a flag in warning. "Easy, boy," Daniel whispered. But Bear didn't ease. Its gaze fixed on the old barn at the far end of the field. The same barn Daniel used to sneak into as a kid before his grandfather Henry would pull him out by the collar. "Some places hold memories that aren't yours to carry," the old man once said. Daniel could almost hear that voice again in the wind. He pushed the gate open. It groaned in protest, the sound slicing through the still air like an old wound reopening. The house stood silent on the hill, its porch sagging but intact. He expected rot and ruin, but the house looked preserved as if someone had just left. Bear patted ahead, nose brushing the steps. Daniel climbed the porch slowly, his breath frosting in front of him. He pulled the key from his pocket, the one the lawyer mailed after his grandfather Henry's death, and slipped it into the lock. It turned smoothly, too smoothly for a door that hadn't been opened in years. Inside, the smell hit him pine soap and tobacco. Not decay, not dust. Something alive, something kept. A single cup sat on the table, a plate beside it. A faint ring of coffee still marked the porcelain. Daniel's pulse quickened. "What the hell?" he muttered. Bear circled the room, nails clicking on the wooden floor, ears twitching with every creak. The place looked like Henry had just stepped outside for firewood. Every photo still hung in place, Henry, in uniform, his parents himself as a boy, with a trout too big to hold. He swallowed hard, his chest tightening against the weight of nostalgia. "You old bastard," he whispered. "You kept it all." Bear stopped in the doorway to the study and growled low. Daniel's flashlight swept across the desk, orderly piles of papers, yellowed letters tied in twine, and in the center a single sealed envelope with his name on it. "For Daniel, when the time comes." His stomach sank. He hesitated only a second before tearing it open. Henry's handwriting was shaky but deliberate. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. There are things I never said, things I couldn't say. Start with the barn, but be sure you want to know what's there. Some truths don't stay buried." Daniel stared at the words until they blurred. The barn, always the barn. A lifetime ago, that place was forbidden ground. He used to imagine it full of treasures, maybe war relics. But Henry had always locked it, warning him with that same cold calm, "Some doors stay shut for a reason." Bear barked once sharp and sudden, snapping Daniel back. The sound came from outside the barn door, shifting in the wind just slightly open. The envelope slipped from his fingers. For a long moment, neither man nor dog moved. Then Daniel spoke, his voice barely more than a breath. "Looks like the land's still keeping secrets, boy." The dog whined, softly pressing its head against his knee, and Daniel knew whatever waited out there wasn't done with the Cross family yet. He looked around the room once more, every shadow familiar yet foreign, then reached for his coat. "Come on, Bear," he said quietly, pocketing the letter. "Let's go meet the ghosts." Snow whispered against the windows as Daniel stood in the middle of the room, the stillness pressing against his chest. The old house breathed quietly, its bones creaking in rhythm with the wind outside. It wasn't the silence that unsettled him, it was the order. Everything inside felt arranged, almost tended to like someone had been living here long after Henry was gone. The floorboards gleamed faintly under the lantern's light, not dusty but polished. The curtains were drawn halfway frozen mid-sway, as though someone had stepped away only moments before. Bear paced beside the table, nose low, ears twitching with every sound. Daniel's eyes followed the dog's movements until they caught on the dining table. 2 bowls sat side by side, a chipped ceramic plate, and beside it a stainless steel dog bowl. Both clean. Both waiting. A faint smile tugged at Daniel's mouth, though his chest ached with something he couldn't name. "You really thought of everything, didn't you, Grandpa Henry?" His voice barely stirred the air. He reached for the chair and sat down, the wood cold beneath his palms. He rubbed the scar on his wrist to the one Bear's teeth had once grazed during training, and looked toward the old writing desk. It stood near the window, its surface spotless, except for a thin layer of morning frost gathering on the corner of a photograph. Henry in his youth stared back at him, stoic eyes like stone, a soldier's pride that time hadn't managed to soften. Beside it lay an unopened envelope sealed in yellowing wax, the name Daniel carved in deliberate blocky handwriting. He hesitated before touching at the paper, surprisingly crisp beneath his fingertips. The seal broke with a soft crack. Inside the letter was brief, but heavy, each word a weight. "If you're reading this, Daniel, check the well behind the barn. What we could not carry we hid where the water turns bitter." Daniel read it twice, then a third time, his pulse slowing with each repetition. He'd expected land deeds or regrets, not a riddle that warned of danger. Bear let out a low whine, drawing his attention back. The dog stood by the desk now, staring at something beneath it. Daniel knelt the floor, cool under his knees. He moved the chair aside and shone his flashlight under the desk. There, half hidden in the shadow, was a small leather collar, the metal tag dulled with age. He reached for it, brushing away dust. The engraving was shallow but clear enough to read. Max, 1953. A name. A year. His uncle had never owned another dog after Daniel left for the army, at least not that anyone mentioned. He turned the tag over. The back was scratched, as if someone had tried to etch something else but stopped halfway. Bear sniffed the collar, then stepped back for bristling along his spine. The air in the room changed denser, heavier. Daniel looked toward the fireplace where ashes still sat cold as though someone had stopped mid-burn. On the mantel lay a rusted lighter and a folded photograph face down. He flipped it over. Henry again, this time older, standing beside another man in military fatigues. Between them, a German shepherd, dark coat, proud, stance eyes alive, even through decades of dust. The back of the photograph carried faint pencil marks. Korea, 1953. He never came home. Daniel's fingers trembled slightly as he set the photo down. "Max," he whispered. The name echoed in the empty room. Bear tilted his head, eyes reflecting the lamplight, quiet but watchful. Daniel folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his jacket pocket. The barn. Always back to the barn. He glanced through the window, its glass fogging with his breath. The silhouette of the old structure loomed in the distance, black against the pale snow, the door shifting faintly with each gust of wind. The same place Henry had locked and forbidden him from entering. The same place that now called him home. Bear barked once, sharp and short, breaking the quiet. Daniel turned toward him, following the dog's gaze back to the corner of the room. The floorboards there were slightly uneven, one plank raised just enough to notice. He crouched down, tracing the edge with his hand, but before he could pry it loose, a sound came from outside, the hollow clang of metal against wood, the kind that didn't belong to wind. Bear's ears shot up. Daniel froze, listening. Another sound followed, softer this time, like footsteps crunching over thin ice. He reached instinctively for his coat and the flashlight. "Stay close," he whispered. Bear moved to his side shoulders, low breath steady. Daniel opened the door crack and peered into the night. The snow reflected the pale moonlight, a field of white stretching to the barn where shadows danced behind the drifting snow. Something out there had moved, slowly, deliberately. He closed the door again, heart thudding once against his ribs. "Not tonight," he murmured, mostly to himself. Bear pressed his head against Daniel's knee, the collar still hanging from his hand, its metal tag cold as truth. The night pressed close around the ranch, heavy and soundless, broken only by the steady crunch of boots through snow. Daniel's flashlight cut a thin line of white through the dark, the beam catching the faint glint of frost on the old barn's latch. Bear padded ahead, his breath puffing clouds in the cold air, tail stiff as a rod. Daniel stopped at the barn doors. They stood slightly ajar, swaying with a long, tired groan each time the wind pushed. He gripped the handle and felt the chill of iron bite into his skin. The padlock hung open. That wasn't possible. He had tugged it earlier that evening and it had been fastened. "Someone's been here," he muttered under his breath, though the words vanished into the dark. Bear's hackles rose, a quiet growl vibrating in his throat. Daniel raised the flashlight, the beam slicing across the barn's interior. Dust floated like ash, the air heavy with oil, wet wood, and rust. He stepped inside, each footfall echoing in the hollow space. The air was colder here, thick with the weight of stillness. Against the far wall stood 2 long wooden crates, each covered carefully with army green canvas. They looked deliberate, almost ceremonial, not like anything left behind by accident. Bear whined softly and refused to move closer. "It's okay, boy," Daniel said quietly, but the reassurance sounded weak even to his own ears. He approached the nearest crate, the light trembling in his hand. The canvas was tucked in neatly at the corners, the fabric stiff with age. As he gripped the edge, dust exploded upward, swirling through the beam like pale smoke. Beneath the crate was sealed with brass brackets, its wood marked with scratches that looked too precise to be from time. The words, carved faintly into the side, stopped him cold. U.S. Army Supply, property of R. Holt. He ran his gloved fingers over the letters. The name matched the one from Henry's photo. Raymond Holt. Bear barked once, sharp and short, startling him. The sound echoed through the rafters, scattering a few birds that had been sleeping in the beams above. Daniel knelt and brushed more dust from the surface until he found the latch holding the lid shut. It wasn't locked, just old, corroded, reluctant to move. He hesitated, his breath visible in the flashlight's beam. Then, slowly, he lifted it. The lid creaked, complaining as though it had been waiting too long to be disturbed. Inside, folded neatly, was a faded American flag, its stars dimmed with dust. Beneath it lay a worn military jacket, its patches frayed but still legible. Under that, a small leather-bound notebook rested against the wood. He reached for it, the cover soft from time edges darkened by oil and dirt. When he opened the first page, the ink had bled into the paper, the words barely readable. Raymond Holt, KIA Korea, 1953. Daniel's throat tightened. The letters seemed too personal to belong to a stranger. He flipped through the next few pages, brief notes about supplies, weather, and patrol routes. Then, near the back, the handwriting changed, shakier, hurried. "He shot me." The letters were pressed deep into the page as if written by a trembling hand at the edge of breath. Daniel froze, staring. The barn seemed to close in around him, the silence thick enough to hear his own pulse. Bear's low growl rumbled again. Daniel turned the flashlight toward him. The dog's ears were flat, his gaze fixed on the far corner of the barn where the shadows deepened beyond the reach of light. "What is it?" Daniel whispered. He moved the beam toward the darkness. For a moment, nothing. Then, just as he began to lower it, something caught a faint impression on the dirt floor. Footprints. Large ones. Fresh. Daniel rose to his feet, heart pounding, and followed the line of prints a few steps. They led to the side door at the back of the barn, its wooden latch splintered clean through. Just beyond that back threshold, a shallow irrigation pond lay only a few steps away, frozen into a treacherous sheet each winter. A thin line of snow had drifted in the wind, pushing it gently across the floor. He turned back toward the crates. The second one covered the canvas undisturbed. The notebook trembled slightly in his hand. "He shot me." The words burned into his mind, looping again and again. He looked at Bear, who now stood rigid eyes, never leaving that darkened corner. "Let's go," Daniel said softly, but Bear didn't move. His nose lifted, sniffing the air, then he let out a sharp bark that broke through the silence like a warning. Daniel's flashlight flickered once, then steadied. Something shifted in the rafters. A soft thump, the faint scrape of wood against wood. Daniel raised the light quickly, but there was nothing. Only the empty beams and dust drifting down like snow. The door behind him swayed with the wind, creaking in slow rhythm. His breath came short and shallow. The letter, the photograph, the caller, all of it led here. He looked again at the notebook, the last line of writing blurring slightly as his hand trembled. Outside, the wind rose suddenly, pushing through the cracks, whistling through the gaps in the boards. Bear barked once more, spinning toward the open door. The snow beyond shimmered faintly in the moonlight, and Daniel thought just for a second that he saw movement, a shadow retreating into the white. He gripped the notebook tighter. "Who's there?" He called, his voice low but steady. No answer, only the sound of Bear's breathing beside him, sharp and uneven. He looked once more toward the open door, then down at the footprints fading slowly beneath the drifting snow. The storm had passed, but the night still held its breath. Daniel sat by the window, the faint glow of the lantern painting long shadows across the wooden walls. The notebook lay open on the table before him, its pages trembling slightly in the draft. Bear rested near the door, ears twitching even in half-sleep. The words, "he shot me," lingered in Daniel's mind like a whisper that refused to fade. He could still smell the barn, the oil, the dust, the iron tang of age, and the feeling of unseen eyes watching him in the dark. He hadn't told anyone. He didn't plan to. Henry's letter had been warning enough, but curiosity had its claws deep in him now. Somewhere between duty and guilt, something in him couldn't let go. The clock ticked softly on the mantel. Outside, the wind had turned sharp again, brushing against the walls like fingertips. Bear suddenly lifted his head, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Daniel froze, listening. At first, he heard nothing. Then, faintly, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crossing the porch. The boards creaked once, twice, as if someone heavy was moving toward the door. Daniel reached for the flashlight and the old rifle leaning against the chair. "Easy, boy," he whispered, but Bear was already on his feet, hackles raised, teeth bared. The steps stopped. Silence stretched until the doorknob turned with a soft metallic click. The door swung open halfway, letting in a burst of cold air and a flurry of snow. Daniel lunged forward, flashlight beam cutting through the entryway. Nothing, only the wind, only the night. Snow swirled into the room, settling across the floorboards. Bear barked once sharp and warning, then ran to the threshold, nose pressed to the air. Daniel's eyes caught something on the table, a coffee cup. He hadn't left one there. The steam rising from it was faint, curling lazily in the lamplight. Thin wet prints tracked from the threshold to the table, melting into small dark halos on the floorboards. He stepped closer, staring. It was Henry's old mug, chipped on one side, the same one that had been clean and dry the day before. And the faint scent of coffee, fresh not stale, drifted upward. "That's not possible," he whispered. Bear whimpered softly, backing away from the open door. Daniel shut it quickly, locking the latch and pulling the curtain tight. His reflection in the window looked pale, hollow-eyed, older than he remembered. The rest of the night passed without another sound, though neither man nor dog slept. The lantern burned low, flickering shadows across the walls that seemed to shift when he looked away. When dawn finally came, it came gray and brittle, the kind of light that held no warmth. Daniel stood at the door, staring at the snow piled high on the porch. Footprints led away from the house, faint but clear, one set heavy boots moving toward the fields. He followed them as far as the fence before the wind erased them. When he returned, Bear was pawing at the floor, near the doorframe, tail stiff, nose twitching. Something was wedged there, a piece of paper folded roughly, the edge damp from melted snow. Daniel pulled it free, his fingers numb from cold. The message inside was short, written in a hand he didn't recognize. "Stop digging, soldier. You're not the only one who lost something here." He read it twice, the words settling like frost in his chest. Soldier. Whoever had written this knew what he was or what he had been. He looked toward the barn, its silhouette dark against the pale sky. The doors were shut now, though he hadn't closed them himself. Bear barked again, this time more urgent, and ran out into the yard. Bear Daniel called, trudging through the snow after him. The dog's tracks cut a clear path toward the back of the barn. When Daniel reached him, Bear was circling something in the snow, nose to the ground. Tire marks. Deep, freshly tread-wide truck tires. They led from the main road to the barn and back out again, the edges still sharp from recent movement. Daniel crouched beside them, brushing his glove over the compressed snow. Somebody was here, he murmured. Bear whined, tail low, eyes fixed on the tree line beyond the pasture. The wind carried the faint scent of exhaust, fading but not gone. Daniel rose slowly, scanning the horizon. Nothing moved. No sound but the whisper of the wind through the dry grass. He turned toward the barn again. The memory of the footprints inside the broken latch, the words in that notebook, they all pointed to the same truth. Someone else knew. Someone who didn't want him there. Bear pressed against his leg, uneasy. Daniel slipped the note into his pocket, the paper crinkling like brittle leaves. Not the only one who lost something, he repeated quietly, his breath clouding the air. The land lay silent, but he felt watched. He glanced once more toward the empty road, half expecting to see headlights cresting the hill. But the road stayed still, the snow falling harder now, erasing tracks as quickly as they appeared. Bear growled low again, nose pointed toward the woods. The morning after the strange note, the sky hung low and gray, as if the clouds themselves were listening. Daniel hadn't slept. He sat by the window with the letter in one hand, the ink smudged slightly where his thumb had pressed too long. The words replayed again and again. Stop digging, soldier. You're not the only one who lost something here. It wasn't a warning. It was a confession. Someone else carried the same ghost. Bear lay by the stove, restless, his tail flicking against the wood floor. Every so often he lifted his head and stared toward the hallway, ears pricked, eyes sharp. Daniel followed his gaze, but saw nothing, only the outline of the study where Henry had spent his final years. He took a slow breath and rose to his feet. The air in the house felt colder now, even with the stove burning low. When he stepped into the study, the smell of tobacco and old paper met him like a memory. The room was untouched since the night before. Except for one thing, the drawer on the left side of Henry's desk hung slightly open just enough to notice. Daniel hesitated, then pulled it out fully. Inside lay a small wooden box, its surface scarred from decades of use. Beneath it, wrapped in an old handkerchief, was a notebook bound in worn leather. He knew before opening it that it wasn't the same as the soldier's journal he'd found in the barn. This one was Henry's. The first page began neatly, the handwriting steady and disciplined like a man accustomed to command. 1952. Korea. The winter came early. Supplies short. Morale worse. Holt keeps me sane. Always talking about home, about her. Daniel read on the words, pulling him into a world of cold mud and distant gunfire. Henry's entries grew more personal with each page, small notes about the men they'd lost, the nights they couldn't sleep, the hope they clung to through letters from home. Then, halfway through the journal, a new name appeared again and again. Rachel. She works in the field hospital south of the ridge. Quiet, steady hands. She never flinches, even when the shells fall close. Daniel turned to the page, his throat tightening. Holt talks about her like she's his anchor. Maybe she is. Maybe she's mine too. I don't know anymore. The war twists everything. The pages that followed blurred with emotion. Raymond and I made it through the ridge alive. Barely. Rachel patched us both up, said we were two halves of the same stubborn heart. Maybe she's right. He loves her. I see it in his eyes. I wish I didn't. Outside, the wind groaned against the walls and the faint creak of the barn door echoed through the distance. He opened the journal again. The later pages were written in a different hand, still Henry's, but unsteady now as if written years later. I brought him home. No one will ever know. Rachel begged me to tell the truth, but I couldn't. Not after what happened. I swore I'd protect the boy. The page after that was torn halfway down, but the last line was still visible, scrawled across the bottom in faded ink. If the boy ever asks, tell him his father died a hero. Daniel's hand trembled slightly as he traced the letters. The boy. The thought burned through him. His father had died in an accident when he was a child, or so he'd always been told. But if Henry's words were true, that meant something else entirely. Bear rose and came to stand beside him, tail-low eyes fixed on the photograph lying under the lamp. It was a picture of a woman, Rachel. Her face was soft, her smile faint, but her eyes carried something haunting. Loss, love, regret. Daniel felt something shift inside him, a heaviness that wasn't quite grief, but close. He crouched, resting his hand on Bear's head. Guess secrets make us both restless, huh? Bear leaned into his touch, pressing his nose against the photograph as if he could smell the sorrow trapped in the paper. For a long moment they stayed that way, the man and the dog both bound by ghosts they couldn't name. Outside, the wind had grown sharper, scattering dry snow against the windows. Daniel turned the page again, but the rest of the diary was blank. He closed it carefully, fingers brushing the worn leather as if it were skin. The silence of the room, deep and heavy, but alive like the house itself, was waiting for him to ask the next question. He slid the diary into his coat pocket and stood his reflection in the window, faint against the morning light. Bear's ears twitched suddenly. He turned toward the door, a low sound rising in his throat. Daniel frowned and followed his gaze. Somewhere beyond the porch, a faint rumble like an engine starting rolled through the cold air, then stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. By afternoon, the storm thinned and pale light spread over the snow. Daniel stood on the porch with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, his thoughts tangled between Henry's diary and the unanswered questions clawing at the edges of his mind. The words, "If the boy ever asks," replayed in his head like a broken record. Who was the boy? What truth had Henry tried to bury so deep that even death couldn't keep it hidden? Bear paced the porch, nose to the air, uneasy. Somewhere in the distance, the faint rumble of an engine grew louder, then stopped just beyond the gate. Daniel straightened, setting the mug aside. A black pickup rolled to a halt by the fence-line tires crunching the ice. The door opened, and a man stepped out mid-40s, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark wool coat and a veteran's posture. He walked with purpose, each step slow, but sure, his boots leaving clean prints in the snow. Afternoon, he called out, voice low, steady. Daniel nodded once. "Can I help you?" The man smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Ben Holt," he said. "You must be Daniel Cross." The name hit harder than Daniel expected. Holt. The same as the soldier from the crate, the same as the name carved on that rusted tag. "That's right," Daniel said carefully. "What brings you out here?" Ben's gaze wandered past him toward the barn. "My grandfather served with your grandfather back in Korea. Raymond Holt. You might have heard the name." Daniel's throat tightened. "Your grandfather," he repeated. "He went missing in the war, didn't he?" Ben nodded slowly, the kind of nod that came from years of retelling the same story. "Never came home," he said. "All we ever got was a telegram that said MIA, presumed dead. My mother, she never believed it, said Henry Cross was the last man to see him alive." Daniel's breath fogged in the cold. He studied Ben's face. There was something in his eyes, an echo of someone else. "Henry passed not long ago," Daniel said quietly. "I came back to settle what's left." Ben gave a small nod, his gaze still fixed on the barn. "I figured as much," he murmured. Then his eyes shifted to Bear, who had moved closer, tail low, body tense. "German Shepherd, huh?" Ben said softly. "My grandfather had one just like that. Named Max. Wouldn't go anywhere without him." The sound of that name made Daniel's pulse stutter. He forced a nod, his voice low. "Yeah," he said. "Heard about him." Ben crouched slightly, offering his hand to Bear, who didn't move, just stared back with unblinking amber eyes. "Beautiful dog," Ben added. "Smart eyes, like he remembers something." Daniel didn't answer. The silence stretched between them, the wind filling it with the faint groan of the barn doors shifting in the distance. Ben stood again, brushing snow from his coat. "Your grandfather," he said, "was a good man, from what I hear. But he kept secrets, didn't he? My mother said he wrote to her once after the war, then stopped. She always wondered why." Daniel's fingers tightened around the railing. Secrets, he said evenly, seemed to run in this family. Ben studied him for a moment, eyes narrowing slightly. "If you find anything, letters, photos, anything from that time, I'd appreciate hearing from you." Daniel nodded, though his stomach had turned to stone. "Sure," he said. "If I find something, I'll let you know." Ben held his gaze for a heartbeat longer, then offered his hand. "Good meeting you, Daniel." His grip was firm cold. Bear growled low, the sound barely audible, but Daniel felt it vibrate through the air. "Easy," he murmured, resting a hand on the dog's head. Ben's smile flickered thin as smoke. "Take care of that one," he said, nodding at Bear. "Some dogs carry memories longer than people do." Then he turned, walking back toward his truck. Daniel watched until the taillights vanished down the road. Bear whined softly, ears pinned back. He moved to the fence, sniffing along the ground, then began pawing at the frozen dirt near one of the posts. "What is it?" Daniel asked, kneeling beside him. The dog kept digging claws, scraping wood and earth until something small and metallic clinked against the frozen ground. Daniel brushed the soil aside and lifted it out, a military dog tag worn thin, the edges rusted. The name stamped into it made his chest tighten. Raymond Holt. He turned it over. The back bore a line crudely scratched by hand, shallow but unmistakable. "He shot me." The words blurred in the weak light, cold biting into his fingers. Bear stood close, pressing against his leg, tail, low eyes fixed on the horizon where Ben's truck had disappeared. Daniel slipped the tag into his pocket, his pulse loud in his ears. The snow began to fall again, fine and silent, covering the disturbed earth between them, as if the land itself was trying to hide the truth once more. The night came heavy and still, the kind that pressed against the windows and seemed to listen. Daniel sat in the kitchen with the dog tag on the table, the faint lamplight catching the edge of the metal. "He shot me." The words seemed to pulse in the quiet. Bear lay by the stove, restless, his breath uneven. Every few minutes the dog lifted his head, ears twitching toward the back door. When Daniel finally stood to turn out the light, Bear moved, suddenly, teeth tugging at the cuff of his jacket, insistent. "What is it?" Daniel whispered. The dog pulled again, stronger this time, whining softly, then glancing toward the door. Outside, the wind carried the smell of snow and something older earth, maybe, or rust. Daniel grabbed the flashlight and followed. The air bit at his skin as he stepped onto the porch. The yard lay silver and silent under a thin veil of frost. Bear trotted ahead, nose to the ground, tail stiff. They passed the barn, the crates locked behind their doors, and made their way toward the back field where the old well stood half hidden among the weeds. Daniel hadn't been near it since he was a child. Henry used to warn him away from it. "The water's bad, son," he would say, bitter as a lie. The words echoed in his mind, now colder than the air. The well's stone rim glistened under the flashlight, slick with ice. Bear stopped beside it, whining paws scraping the ground. Daniel shone the beam downward. The light cut through the dark for only a few feet before meeting water. Then, just beyond the rippling surface, something glinted, a flash of metal deep below. He crouched, heart thudding, and found an old rope coiled nearby, stiff but still strong. Hooking it around the handle of a rusted bucket, he lowered it slowly, the rope creaking against the stone. The metal clinked once, then twice. When he drew it back up, it was heavier than he expected. The bucket emerged dripping, a small tin box wedged inside its sides, streaked with rust. Daniel set it on the ground and pried it open with his knife. The hinges groaned. Inside, wrapped in layers of cloth gone soft with age, were several photographs and a small silver bracelet. He lifted the top photo, his breath catching. 3 figures stared back, Henry Raymond Holt and a woman between them. Rachel. Her arm was linked through Henry's, her smile faint but warm, and in her other arm she held a baby wrapped in a white blanket. Daniel turned the picture over. The writing on the back was faded but legible. William, 1954. The name struck like a physical blow. His throat closed and the air seemed to drain from his lungs. He whispered, that's my father's name. The flashlight trembled in his hand. Bear pressed close, resting his head gently against Daniel's arm, eyes soft, ears low. Daniel stared at the photograph again, tracing the outline of Henry's face. The truth unfolded in silence, brutal and undeniable. Henry hadn't just killed his friend. He had taken what was left Rachel the child and built his life around the lie. He had raised that boy as his own, and that boy had become Daniel's father. Every story, every photograph, every memory of love and loyalty, none of it was what it seemed. Daniel sank to his knees beside the well, the frozen ground biting through his jeans. Bear nudged his shoulder, letting out a soft, mournful sound. You knew, didn't you? Daniel said quietly, voice breaking. You always know before I do. The dog whined again, his breath fogging the air between them. Daniel looked toward the horizon where the land met the trees, where the past seemed to stretch endlessly forward. He killed his best friend, Daniel whispered, and raised his son to keep the secret. The words tasted bitter, metallic like the air itself. He turned the photo over once more, the name burning in his mind. William, 1954. He reached for the bracelet next its silver dull with age, but the engraving still clear. Or the initials of Rachel Mercer, the woman caught between two men, two loyalties, two lives. Daniel's hand trembled as he closed the box again. The night wind shifted, carrying a sound, a low creak, distant but familiar. He turned toward the barn. The doors swayed gently, though there was no wind strong enough to move them. Bear growled low, body tense. Daniel stood gripping the tin box, his pulse drumming in his ears. The snow underfoot was marked with prints as the dogs and another set leading away from the well toward the barn. Fresh ones. He lifted the flashlight, the beam quivering across the yard, catching a shape moving at the edge of the dark, a figure still as stone watching. Then, as the light reached him, the man turned and vanished into the shadows. The morning light came thin and gray, bleeding weakly through the cracks in the shutters. Daniel hadn't slept. The photograph from the tin box lay on the table, the faces staring back at him. Henry, Raymond, Rachel, and the infant who bore his father's name. The truth had rearranged everything he thought he knew, tearing the past open like an old wound that refused to close. Outside, the snow had stopped, but the air still carried the stillness of a place that had seen too much. Bear paced by the window ears, flicking toward the barn. He had been restless since dawn, his instincts sharp, his gaze drawn again and again to that silent structure. Daniel followed his eyes and felt the same pull, a quiet insistence that the answers weren't done with him yet. He zipped his jacket, pocketed the photograph, and stepped outside. The cold met him like a wall. His boots broke through the crusted snow, each step loud in the morning quiet. Bear walked close at his side, tail low, the dog's breath forming pale ghosts in the air. When they reached the barn, the door stood half open again, swaying slightly as if caught between invitation and warning. Daniel hesitated only a moment before pushing it wide. The smell hit him first oil wood, and beneath that something faintly metallic, something old. The light from his flashlight slid over the crates, catching the dust floating like thin smoke. The first one, he already knew the flag, the jacket, the notebook that ended with the accusation. But the second remained untouched, the canvas still pulled tight across the lid. Bear whined softly and pressed against his leg. I know, Daniel whispered. We have to. He gripped the corner of the canvas and pulled. Dust exploded into the air, catching the light. Beneath lay a crate sealed with a brass latch polished faintly as if someone had touched it not long ago. Daniel's hands shook as he unfastened it. The hinges groaned in protest as the lid lifted. The sight inside stopped his breath. Bones. Human bones wrapped carefully in what was left of a military blanket. The skull rested near the top, tilted slightly to one side, the remnants of fabric still clinging to its jaw. On the chest lay a folded piece of paper, yellowed, but intact, its edges curling from age. Daniel reached for it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was Henry's, recognizable even through the shaking strokes of guilt. I killed him. I called it an accident. But I buried him here near his dog Max. I raised his son as my own because guilt was heavier than blood. Daniel's vision blurred. The barn around him seemed to shrink, the air thick with the weight of years of silence. He sank to his knees beside the crate, the letter crumpling slightly in his grasp. "You did it," he whispered. "You really did it." The words tasted like iron. Bear moved closer, circling once before lying down beside the crate. He rested his head gently on the edge of the wood, his eyes half closed as if keeping watch over the dead. The gesture broke something in Daniel that had held for decades. The tears came quietly, uninvited years of grief and confusion finally spilling free. His shoulders trembled as he touched the crate's worn shroud. "You didn't just bury a man, Grandpa," he said softly, voice raw. "You buried all of us." The words hung in the cold air, and for a moment he swore he could hear the echo of Henry's voice, distant and weary. Some truths don't stay buried. He wiped at his face, though the tears kept coming, each one carving its own path through the dust. Bear shifted slightly, letting out a soft sigh, the kind of sound that carried both comfort and sorrow. Daniel looked down at the letter again, the ink faded but clear. Guilt heavier than blood. He thought of his father William, the boy Henry had raised under the shadow of another man's death. He thought of Rachel, who had loved one man and lost two. Every name, every face, every photograph now belonged to the same tragedy, stitched together by choices no one had dared to confess until now. Outside, the wind rose, brushing against the barn walls, making them groan like old wood remembering pain. Daniel closed the crate gently, his hands steady, now his eyes dry but hollow. The silence that followed was absolute. Bear lifted his head, ears twitching, then turned toward the door. Something outside had shifted the faint crunch of snow under slow, deliberate footsteps. Daniel's hand froze on the latch. The sound outside grew clearer, the slow, deliberate crunch of boots on frozen snow. Daniel froze beside the crate, the letter still in his hand. Bear's ears twitched, a low growl building deep in his chest. The barn door creaked, then swung open, letting in a slice of pale light and the figure that stepped through it. Ben Holt. His breath fogged in the air, his eyes sharp, colder than the wind. In his right hand he held a pistol. "You found it," he said quietly, gaze falling to the crate. "You found what he did." Daniel rose slowly, his pulse steady but his voice shaking. "Ben, listen." Don't Ben cut in, stepping closer. "You read the letter. You know the truth. He murdered my father and buried him like a stray dog, and now you think you can stand here and keep his secrets." His voice trembled with rage barely contained. Daniel raised his hands slightly, palms open. "He was my uncle," he said softly, "and I just found out too. Everything you're feeling, I'm feeling it too." Ben's eyes burned. "You had his blood," he said. "That's enough." Bear growled again, stepping between them, his body low, tail straight, a silent warning. The gun trembled in Ben's hand. "Step aside," he said. "This isn't about you." Daniel shook his head. "It's exactly about me. You think killing me will make the past right. It won't. It'll just bury another man in the same ground." For a moment, the wind was the only sound, slipping through the cracks in the barn walls like a whisper of ghosts. Then Ben took another step forward, his boot striking the wood hard enough to echo. "He took everything from us," he said, voice breaking. "My grandfather, my mother's peace, even the truth. He made us grow up in the dark, believing our family was gone. And you, his blood, you get to live like none of it happened." His finger tightened on the trigger. Bear barked once, the sound loud and sharp. Daniel took a single step closer, his breath visible in the cold. "Ben, I can't change what he did," he said, "but I can stop it from happening again. No more secrets, no more graves." Ben's eyes flicked to the dog, then back to Daniel. The air hung heavy with the weight of old sins. The gun lifted slightly, the barrel aligned with Daniel's chest. "You don't get to forgive him," Ben whispered. "You don't get to wash his hands clean." The gun went off. but before the bullet could find its mark, Bear lunged. His body collided with Ben's arm, throwing off the aim. The shot tore through the air, grazing Daniel's shoulder. The impact spun him backward, pain blooming hot and sharp. Bear hit the ground hard, then scrambled to his feet, teeth bared, growling deep and guttural. Ben stumbled, losing balance as the ice beneath the barn's open threshold gave a sudden sharp crack. He slipped backward, landing on the frozen surface of the pond that stretched behind the building. The sound of fracturing ice split the quiet like thunder. "Ben," Daniel shouted, stumbling toward him, clutching his bleeding arm. The cracks spread fast, dark veins running across the white surface. Ben tried to push himself up, his breath ragged. "Stay back," he yelled. But the ice gave way beneath him. In one shattering instant, he disappeared into the black water. Daniel dropped to his knees at the edge, reaching out, fingers brushing the jagged rim of ice. "Hold on," he shouted, plunging one arm into the freezing water. The cold bit deep, burning his skin, but he caught a hand Ben's gripping tight with desperate strength. "No more deaths," Ben Daniel said through gritted teeth. "It ends here." For a moment, Ben's eyes met his, wide with shock, anger, and something like grief. Then his grip weakened, his strength fading fast. Daniel braced his legs against the edge, pulling with everything left in him. Bear barked wildly behind them, the sound echoing through the empty field. With one final heave, Daniel hauled Ben onto the ice, rolling him clear of the edge. The man lay gasping, shivering, the gun lost somewhere beneath the frozen surface. Daniel knelt beside him, chest heaving, his own wound throbbing with heat against the cold. He tore a strip from his shirt and wrapped Bear's bleeding paw tight, whispering thanks into the dog's fur. "It's over," he said softly. Ben didn't answer, only stared at the sky, the breath trembling from his lips. Bear limped forward and pressed his nose against Daniel's hand, whining softly. Blood stained the snow near his paw, but his eyes were steady, filled with something that felt almost human, pleading, weary compassion. Daniel ran a shaking hand over the dog's fur, his voice a broken whisper. "You're right, buddy. No more blood, no more graves." Bear lay down beside him, pressing close for warmth, their breaths mingling in the freezing air as the wind carried the last echoes of gunfire away across the frozen land. The morning came quiet and pale, the kind of silence that followed storms and confessions. The snow had fallen through the night, covering the yard in a soft white blanket, smoothing the earth where footprints and blood had been. The air was clean sharp, untouched. Daniel stood by the oak tree at the edge of the property, the ground there dark where he had cleared away the snow. Beside him lay the folded letter, the faded photograph of 3 faces and a child, and the old dog tag that had carried the truth through generations. Ben stood a few paces away, his coat still damp from the night before, his expression drawn and hollow but steadier than it had been. His eyes were fixed on the items Daniel placed in the small hole between the oak's roots. Bear sat close to Daniel, tail still watching quietly. The wind moved gently through the branches above them, shaking loose flakes of snow that fell like soft ash. Daniel knelt, his fingers brushing the frozen soil. "The land remembers," he said, his voice low and certain. "But maybe now it can forgive." For a long moment neither man spoke. The words seemed to settle into the air like the snow, fragile but lasting. Ben nodded once, a quiet gesture of acceptance. He looked at Daniel not as an enemy but as something closer to kin, both of them carved from the same grief, both marked by the same truth. "What will you do now?" he asked. Daniel didn't look up. "Keep it quiet," he said. "Keep it honest. The rest, I'll figure out." The road was still buried and the radio dead in the storm. For now, the dead could rest where they were until spring. Ben's gaze drifted toward the barn in the distance. Its roof bowed slightly under the weight of snow. "You'll leave it standing?" Daniel followed his look and nodded. "Some things shouldn't be destroyed," he said. "They should just be left to rest." Ben's breath shuddered out, turning to mist in the cold. He reached into his coat, pulling out a small brass key, the same one Daniel had given him after pulling him from the frozen water. He pressed it into Daniel's palm. "You should have it," Ben said. "You earned it more than anyone." Daniel closed his hand around it, the metal cold but grounding. "We both did," he said. Ben offered a faint, weary smile, the first trace of peace either of them had shown since the day began. Then he turned, walking toward the long road that led out of the valley. The snow creaked under his boots, each step fading until there was only the whisper of wind. Daniel watched him until he was gone. The sky was turning silver now, the sun a dull coin behind a veil of cloud. He turned back toward the barn, the key still in his hand, and walked slowly across the field. Bear followed his paws, sinking into the snow with soft crunches. When they reached the barn, Daniel paused at the door. The wood was cold beneath his fingers. Inside, the air was still heavy with the scent of dust and time. He looked once more at the crates, the place that had swallowed generations of silence, and locked the door for the last time. The key turned with a solid click. Then he took a small wooden board from the workbench and nailed it across the door. The words he carved were simple and firm, the edge of the nail serving as his chisel. "Do not open. The truth rests here." The sound of hammering echoed faintly in the still air, then faded. He stepped back, breathing hard, his breath rising like smoke. Bear sat beside him, eyes bright against the dim light. "It's done," Daniel said softly. "Finally." The wind picked up, brushing against the barn like a sigh. He turned toward the house, his shoulder still bandaged, his movement slow but sure. The afternoon wore on, the snow deepening. By the time he reached the porch, the sun had begun to sink behind the mountains, casting the land in a gold that melted into blue. Bear climbed the steps first, circling once before lying down beside Daniel's chair. The dog rested his head on Daniel's boots, eyes half closed. Daniel smiled faintly, running a hand through the thick fur. "You saved me twice, buddy," he said quietly. "Once from war, once from myself." Bear's tail thumped once, a slow, tired rhythm as if he understood. Light spilled over the snow in the house of too many memories. For the first time, Daniel breathed without weight. He looked toward the mountains, where the day was fading. The land stretched endless before him, quiet, patient, as if waiting for something new to grow. Bear shifted, pressing closer for warmth. Daniel leaned back, eyes soft, the ache in his shoulder pulsing gently, like a heartbeat that finally knew its rhythm again. Behind them, the sign on the barn creaked faintly in the wind, the words catching the last light of day. "Do not open. The truth rests here." The sound of the wind through the branches was low and steady, almost like a voice exhaling in peace. Snow began to fall again, light and slow. The world seemed to pause there, two silhouettes, one man. One dog sitting together in silence as dusk turned the valley gold. And as the final breath of wind moved through the trees, the wooden sign swayed softly, its echo fading like the sigh of a man who had finally been forgiven. If this story touched you, hit like and subscribe for more. Which moment stayed with you the most, Daniel's forgiveness or Bear's loyalty? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from.